For centuries, humanity's been a little bit furry. No matter what way you spin it, we've worn masks of animals for centuries, for all sorts of reasons. But in this month's read, the animal masks let you hack things and kill stuff, and sometimes there's a dead woman's consciousness inside. If you're new here, my name is Ambrose, and welcome to castleguytv, where you can expect bitchy book reviews and media commentary to make us both more conscientious readers and writers.
That sign can't stop me, because I can't read!
Did I miss my goal of getting this out before the end of Pride Month? Absolutely. However, in my defense, we're covering not one, but two books featuring a trans woman and a cis woman in a lesbian relationship. It's the 4th of July. You know I support my troops. Today we're doing a full review of Seth Haddon's sapphic science fiction novella Volatile Memory, and an arc review of its sequel Null, which is releasing later this month. As always, a big thank you to NetGalley and Tor Publishing for providing me an advance copy. Since today we're reading two books in one video, our major analysis is going to be of Volatile Memory, and then I'll give a brief overview of Null. I'll have everything timestamped, but if you're worried about spoilers, don't. NetGalley's guidelines for ARC reviews requires that I avoid spoiling anything, so you're in good hands. As always, any criticisms given today, good or bad, are not grounds to harass anyone involved with the writing or publication of either of these books. If you do anything stupid, I'll know and I'll find you. While I yap, today you can watch me play peaceful mode on Mice Rat because I'm a big baby and I'm afraid of anyone destroying my house. But before we dive in, if this type of content is your jam, make sure to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and hit the subscribe button. Every bit of engagement counts for small channels, and I try to keep up with discussions as much as I can. And also, because I missed Pride Month, if I don't hit 100 subscribers, my cats are going to start calling me the mean word for gay. Don't let me be victim to their internalized homophobia. If you're unfamiliar with today's feature, Seth Haddon is an up-and-coming author who up until now I believe has been represented by Blind Eye Books, which is an indie press specializing in LGBTQ sci-fi and fantasy. Volatile Memory and Null are his first titles with Tor, which some of you may recognize as a juggernaut of speculative fiction publishing. He's very active on social media, especially his Instagram, and he's a good example of how developing a social media following goes a long way in moving up in the writing world by boosting your reach to new audiences. I heard of him by word of mouth from someone who discovered his work on Instagram, for example. He also writes spicier stories under a pen name and an alternative Instagram account for those curious. I'm not really a smut person, so I can't speak to his work there, but feel free to peruse on your own time if you're curious. This is Haddon's first foray into sci-fi. It's not bad by any means, but it definitely shows some growing pains that we'll discuss later. Haddon's start is in fantasy romance, with a series of standalone novels set in the same world starting with Reforged, followed up by Reborn and ending with Reclaimed, and a prequel novel called Crucible, which I believe is either getting funded or has been funded on Kickstarter. This is where I learned about him because I love internet drama that I'm not a part of, and Haddon came under brief fire by some folks for his representation of his trans main character in Reclaimed. Before anyone drops any anvils, it was a nothing burger bit of drama, basically the internet bean soup theory but for books. Haddon is a cis man for context, which I think is part of why any of it happened. We'll talk about this part a little bit later in our analysis. In general, you can expect well-crafted core metaphors and concepts with some room for growth that, with his roots in romance, can err on being a little bit overtly sappy. Not exactly a bad thing, just depends on what you want from a story. With that out of the way, let's get into content warnings. Underage or arranged marriage, assault, infertility, murder, suicide, gender dysphoria, violence, gun violence, gore, medical trauma, body horror, misogyny, classism, sexual harassment, sexism, blood, bioessentialism, domestic abuse, grief, war, codependency or poor boundaries, loss of bodily autonomy, sexual violence, body loss, and probably some other stuff. Shit gets weird. As always, let's look at our dust jacket summary first. Seth Haddon's science fiction debut, Volatile Memory, is a heart-filled, vengeful sapphic sci-fi action adventure novella. With nothing but a limping ship and an outdated mask to her name, Willa needs a big payday. When the call goes out that a lucrative piece of tech is waiting on a nearby planet, she relies on all the swiftness of her prey animal instincts to beat other hunters to it. What you found wasn't your ticket out. It was my corpse wearing an AI mask. When you touched the mask, you heard my voice, a consciousness spinning through metal and circuits, a bodiless mind spun to life in the Hawk's temporary storage. It crystallized, and I was alive. Masks aren't supposed to retain memory, much less identity. But the woman inside the Mark I Hawk is real, and she sees Willa in a way no one ever has, sees her, and doesn't find her wanting or unwhole. Armed with military-grade tech and a lifetime of staying one step ahead of the hunters, Willa and Hawk set off to get answers from the man who discarded Hawk once before, her ex-husband. We open with the narration in second person. Our protagonist, Willa, is following a signal on a barren planet, Foland's World? I don't know. That is essentially used as a landfill for the Corporate Federation, one of our big bad world powers in this universe. The signal is loud and important, and our focal character, Willa, is just one of many scavengers rushing to be first to grab it and see what it is and sell it for credits. This is a fast-paced action scene that includes Willa fending off a number of fellow scavengers, including an old estranged friend named Orchid. The important thing to know here is that just about everyone who is anyone has a mask from Visor Forge, also an important name for later, and each of these masks is based on an animal. Willa has one of the worst and oldest masks on the market, a Mark I rabbit, which gives her access to loads of information and uses the instincts and ability of a prey animal to help her identify potential threats and allow her some additional boosts to her capability of escape. Orchid during this scene is wearing an ox, and it makes him real strong. However, Willa manages to take down her aggressors and shows mercy on Orchid by only shooting him in the leg before proceeding for the signal. This is where she finds what she believes to be a Mark I hawk on a dead body, and this is the source of the signal. She touches it, and at once our narrator snaps into a clear reality, and we learn that this book is narrated by the mask, or rather, the consciousness trapped inside of it. That paragraph from the dust jacket is the final quotation from the first chapter, where we realize that we're reading the mask's narration. After Willa speeds off with her spoils, she decides to try on the hawk, and in some ways their consciousnesses link, which freaks Willa out. At this point, the hawk is just the hawk. She doesn't remember who she is or anything about her. After this, Willa heads to BTW02, a planet where a contact of hers, an appraiser, waits. While Willa is waiting on the appraiser to take a look, there's more telepathic communication where Willa realizes that there's a consciousness inside the mask and the hawk knows Willa's name. Willa identifies Hawk as being the woman she found dead on Foland's World. Once the appraiser shows up, she touches the mask and also realizes there's a consciousness, and also that the mask has a pressure-sensitive rig to destroy something inside, and that it was lined with nanoskin of some sort modified to prevent it from being taken off. At this point, the mask narrates, claiming that the notion of the mask hurting Willa made her afraid, and that she wished she could tell her so. The manner of the narration includes a lot of asides of this kind. Anyway, at the risk of lowering the value of the mask, Willa agrees to let the appraiser remove the nanoskin and disable the pressure rig, and once the cord is cut on the rig, described as like a firewall lifting, the mask's consciousness regains a great deal of her memories and remembers her name, which is Sable, and her death, where a man was shouting at her and then there was a gunshot. Unfortunately, because the appraiser was touching the mask, the appraiser also remembers this and is rightfully freaked out. She's going on about how storing consciousness is impossible and something is whack with the mask. She describes it as a prototype from Visor Forge that they'll be wanting back and offers to shut down the mask altogether to scrap it for parts. She's very insistent on this, but the memory inside the hawk is stored in, you guessed it, the volatile memory, so shutting down the mask will kill her entirely. But Willa has already pack bonded with her bird mask and threatens the appraiser by holding a gun to her head that Sable claims Willa did not want to fire, but that she wished she had a mask that would let her be violent. The rabbit just isn't cutting it. Sable says she could be that for Willa and Hawk together. Willa is disgruntled, naturally, by the appraiser and leaves. Now the two protagonists get to formally introduce each other, and we settle into Sable being Sable and not just the Mark I Hawk. They get to know each other better, which is where we get Sable asking about, gently, what it's like for Willa to feel the way she does about the body she's in, being her transness, while Willa asks about Sable's past, like her husband, and if he was good to her, which we learn no, he was not. Willa got defensive when the subject of her transness came into discussion, and Sable gets into a very pointed discussion of womanhood and how Willa can't say either of them is or is not a woman because she's a sentient mask. She's a woman because she's a woman, not because of who she was or what her body used to be, and then includes that her body didn't function in life like a quote-unquote woman was supposed to, being that she was infertile, and that it was seen as a moral failing on her part by her husband, which confirms him being Dookie. Willow left her family to transition, with her family saying that the corporate federation, quote, couldn't abide by individuals. Meanwhile, as they're trying to leave BTW02, Willa is trying to find a way to abandon her rickety old ship when ships she thinks are from the Marshall Syndicate are arriving at the landing port. She realizes, however, that they're actually from Visor Forge, and it's highly likely that they're looking for her and Sable. But Willow wants a challenge and is feeling brave, so she decides she's going to hijack one of Visor Forge's ships. There's androids and guards and such getting off of the ships, and our heroines are trying to hide in plain sight before they get flagged down. One of them clocks Willa somehow, and the other one is demanding that Willa hand over the Hawk mask, but instead she puts it on. And there's a fight scene where Sable realizes she's able to control an android nearby while also residing inside of the Hawk at the same time. So she uses the android against the guards, and then cites her hijacking the android as grounds for the mass amounts of security guards with guns to lower their weapons and let her go, which I don't know if I get unless the weapons are somehow hackable. I don't know. Anyway, they fly off. There's a brief moment in which Willa is having a mild bit of buyer's remorse, so to speak, because she didn't want to kill the people that she did during the fight and is afraid of Sable even if she doesn't say it outright. This is a common characterization that I don't think goes anywhere, but Willa is described as being averted to killing or violence and being too nice, but held a gun to the appraiser's head for no reason really other than challenging the existence of the mask. And even though she just immobilized him, she did also shoot Orchid in the leg. That's not a bad thing compared to everyone else in the setting, but let's not pretend that she's a total pacifist. We also learn that Visor Forge has placed bounties on Willa's head. At some point, Willa expresses anxiety over her feelings of responsibility toward the Hawk mask and Sable, and wonders if she's not equipped to figure out what's going on technologically with the mask or figuring out the mystery behind Sable's circumstances. And there's some sweeping declarations of their intentions to figure things out together, primarily because of the people involved so far. Willa is the only one to express any compassion toward Sable instead of greed toward Hawk. Willa agrees to finding out what happened to Sable, citing that she, quote, doesn't want to be prey. Next chapter, Sable and Willa are doing research using a holo prop that the rabbit mask pulled up from the feed, which is like an ad or holographic billboard, I'm not really sure, and frankly I don't recall much of the concrete details of how they knew to look there or whatever, but we learn that Sable is Sable Alzian, and the Mark I Hawk is actually a Mark I lyrebird. And the lyrebird is a mimic of some sort, which makes Sable worry that she's a mimicry of her dead self and not just herself. We learn that her husband, Feister, who works for Visor Forge, signed her up for the testing trials for the lyrebird prototypes after learning she couldn't bear children, essentially discarding her. She was married off to him at a young age, essentially sold as a child bride. There were other wives too, and they moved from ship to ship for some reason, but all in all it just sucked in every respect. There's also a conversation in which Sable ruefully expresses envy of Willa's body, and Willa expresses feeling almost guilty that she spent so much time at odds with her body and not, quote, making use of it in the way Sable might, with an implication of either asexuality or being so uncomfortable with her body that the notion of sexuality hasn't felt possible. It's not directly stated, which I like, because you get to interpret it yourself. Anyway, yada yada yada, the girlies are bonding. And because Sable spent so much time dreaming of murdering her husband, when Willa expresses anger at all the bad things that happened to Sable when she was alive, she also asks what they're going to do about it, which means it's murder time. There's some questionable prose choices, like Sable refers to her feelings as a mycelium array of malice, which doesn't quite feel right to me, but also fun things like her describing herself as she imagined holding Feister's head as, quote, sitting in the viscera of my imagined revenge, gleefully jumping up and down, and you were trying to make sure we could live after the fact. One of the things that we miss because Sable isn't in a body is her ability to express herself with it. Willa isn't described much in that manner either, but this for some reason made me feel a lot of affection for Sable's character. She sometimes has an, impish quality to her that I like. While they're trying to find Feister's location and get there, though, some scavengers have come to intercept Sable's ship. Orchid is back and ready to steal back his mark. In the chaos, things have become so dire that Sable begs Willa to let her take control while there's a gun to Willa's head, and Sable, as Willa, kills Orchid. Things get stated outright a lot, though, like Sable's apparent remorse for inhabiting Willa's body and her desire to bludgeon Orchid. Quote, I think I could have killed him like that, bluntly, if I made you hit him over and over. But I thought about the blood and the way it would stain. I thought about you looking down at your beautiful marred hands and knowing what I used your body for. You would never forgive me. You would never forgive yourself. You who had never known peace with your flesh, who trusted me. I had taken something precious from you. I had stepped into your body as if to remind you it still wasn't really yours. And for a moment, Willa's consciousness does come back a bit, and she twitches her hand as if either trying to take back over or to tell Sable to stop. It's really unclear, which is fine, but Sable shoots Orchid in the head, and Willa is not happy. She claims that Sable killed the both of them, which doesn't really make sense to me, since they would have been dead anyway if they let Orchid live. But she then restates what Sable did and says, quote, this is my body, mine. I made it mine, and you stepped in. And similar fare in this conflict between them. I think where some people may have found things as creepy was Sable, because she's literally having constant access to Willa's feelings, points out that she would have dumped Sable long ago if she hadn't felt powerful putting her on, which could read as a, actually, you know you liked it, if we were looking at this as an essay allegory, and this being like an attempt to gaslight. But again, she literally has access to Willa's brain, and likewise. So as a compromise, she, in very abstract terms, opens her mind up more to Willa. I'm not personally sure what the tangible shift is there. Anyway, using the Lyrebird mask's mimicry abilities, Willa speaks as Orchid to two scavengers that are on different ships who are waiting for him to come back with the mask. However, she messes up, and after admitting to not remembering about the details for Lyrebird that Orchid would have known, one of his buddies rattles off a code, think kind of like Thieves' Cant, that Willa would have no way of knowing, revealing that she's an imposter. So Willa and Sable speed off to dodge Orchid's buddies, and while Willa is decompressing, she compares their mind meld fusion as something similar to the Edenic Order, which shows up once or twice in the narration. Basically, they're described as a fringe cult of people who have propagated plants from the old Earth that died out centuries ago to try to create a new home for humanity. I think I kind of butchered that, but anyway, we learn that Willa at one point wanted to join them and sacrifice her body as a vessel to it to feel like something good could come from it, which isn't too far from the reason why Crane and You Weren't Meant to Be Human originally joined his hive, except he didn't read the terms and conditions too close. During their chat, Willa acknowledges that Sable took over her body to save her, and they make up on the terms that Sable only does it again when Willa says so, or if Sable asks, which she agrees to. Willa kisses the mask on the beak, and Sable isn't actually able to feel it, but she imagines it, and there's some kind of unspoken commitment to Willa now wearing the Lyrebird as a form of increased closeness. Meanwhile, Feister is located, and using Lyrebird to mimic Orchid and using his gun to transmit a false ID to get passage on Feister's planet station. They also dodge a guard of some sort by pretending to be one of Feister's wives. Anyway, Sable and Willa make it to Feister's apartment. Meanwhile, alarms go off warning of Willa's arrival and the station being shut down as a result. Despite being against killing a few chapters ago, Willa shoots the guard that questions her before he could shoot her first, and it's announced that Visor Forge will arrive in 15 minutes. They rush to the apartment and Sable gets access to the door as herself. We also learn at some point in all of this that Sable, whose government last name is Alzian, has the maiden name Vianya. This doesn't come up a lot until the end and in Book 2. After holding him at gunpoint and questioning him, using the lyrebird to let Sable's voice come from Willa's mouth, Feister warns that Visor Forge is sending subsidiaries, which are basically special agents. Sable then asks Willa to put the lyrebird on Feister. He's honestly a very flat, evil bad guy, but what we learn here is that Sable has an ability to create a quote-unquote construct, essentially forcing her way into his mind to create a space in his mind where they face off as themselves in their minds. Basically, this is to circumvent complete and total White Room syndrome, but it raises questions about Sable's yearning to touch Willa if she's able to touch Feister in a showdown. Anyway, she confronts Feister and argues with him, and he's a brick wall. We do learn that Sable is the sole survivor of the lyrebird testing, and no one knows why she specifically survived. He claims that Sable killed herself as part of an ultimatum. Either she does it, or Feister simply lets her go and frees her from her icky marriage. He refuses, so she shoots herself in the stomach to give enough time for Lyrebird to finish uploading her memories, and then he dumps her body at Folan's world before Visor Forge can figure it out. In very abstract, again, terms, Sable kills Feister in the construct, which kills him in real life by essentially boiling his brain, which makes the insides of the lyrebird real gross, and Sable is just tickled. In our last chapters, we get the first real bit of additional world building beyond the bare bones. The Marshall Syndicate and Corporate Federation are possibly in cahoots, and a subsidiary is in fact hunting them. To dodge the subsidiary, Willa erases herself from the great big database in the sky and becomes, you guessed it, a null entity. Guys, you get it, right? Just like fantasy, when we think of sci-fi, often we tend to divide sci-fi into a few major subcategories before we get into the niches. Hard sci-fi, soft sci-fi, and then usually science fantasy. I think the best way I can describe the spectrum of hard versus soft sci-fi is how close you are to reading an engineering or biology textbook versus how close you are to reading your archetypal comic book. Depending on who you ask, the terms hard and soft in this context have to do with the types of sciences involved, with your hard sciences being essentially your STEM acronym, and soft being the soft sciences like psychology, sociology, and related categories. Or, and this is the definition I feel is a more easily understood one, soft science fiction leans on the inherent suspension of disbelief of a reader to drive the plausibility of the science, where hard science fiction makes an effort to affirm the plausibility of its speculative science through pre-existing scientific knowledge. The man himself considered responsible for coining the term soft science fiction, Peter Nichols, in his 1979 reference work The Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, describes a similar distinction as what I've described and considers the term to be imprecise. Nichols argues that because there is a lack of agreed upon standards to define it, we should treat soft versus hard sci-fi as a description of qualities and tendencies in fiction versus a subgenre. We can see this given that there are some really awesome works in sci-fi that incorporate elements of both. Films like Gattaca, identified by NASA as one of the most scientifically accurate sci-fi films of all time, is considered a blend of both hard and soft science fiction, as its focus on the soft sciences and the psychological, sociological implications of a world where social hierarchy is entirely dictated from birth based on genetic factors to the point of natural, unmodified births being stigmatized, is backed by real scientific knowledge regarding genetics and the very structure of DNA, which dips into hard science. Similarly, Interstellar built its bones on pre-existing scientific knowledge such as wormholes to circumvent soft sci-fi tropes like light speed travel the ecological destruction that forms the backdrop of the trouble on Earth, physics regarding black holes, gravitational time dilation, and Einstein's general theory of relativity are all major factors in the movie's plot. However, there are certain questions unanswered by science that forced Interstellar to take on soft sci-fi elements in the speculative sense, such as the notion of the fifth dimension, ideas of what all exists on the other side of a black hole, and so on. There are some people who really hated Interstellar. Personally, I thought that it was really great for what it was. You're entitled to your own opinion. Anyway, Volatile Memory is very soft sci-fi, which is part of how it gets away with being at such a breakneck speed pace. I wouldn't go so far as to say that the book was spectacularly grounded, but all the things that in the past I felt bogged me down in fiction regarding space travel and so on didn't do so here. There are some flaws, though we'll get into that later. But first, one of the best way Haddon makes sure that the reader is able to follow along with the fantastical tech without bogging them down with deep research papers is by rooting their design and function in existing real-life knowledge. Not in a hard science way, though. What I'm referring to right now is the animal masks. Rabbit gives the survival tools of a prey animal, a crow mask helps identify the worth of shinies, a hawk identifies weak points for killing, an ox makes the user really strong, a lyrebird mimics masks, databases, etc. Without bogging down the prose, Haddon still gains the same effect he would have earned with hard science, but uses layman's knowledge about the natural world. This is a stellar example of how authors can write quote-unquote accessible science fiction for people who aren't typically science fiction readers. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of science fiction novels I adore, but Volatile Memory was a breath of fresh air when it came to how quickly I found myself in the world understanding the logic of its sci-fi elements versus other titles. How the book gets away with this is also one of its greatest weaknesses, which we'll touch on in our world building section. However, we can't just talk about conventions of sci-fi. Volatile Memory isn't just a science fiction novel. There's some elements of romance, there's some adventure elements, but Volatile Memory sits firmly within the cyberpunk subgenre of science fiction. We'll talk more about how romance factors in the pacing section. Just know that there are some structure promises that the duology flubs by being 2 books, and we'll talk about cyberpunk in just a second. But first, I want to talk about sentient object fiction. Volatile Memory has been described as being sentient object romance by some people online, and to a degree we have to agree because it is fiction that includes a sentient object and is part of a romance, but in the most respectful way possible, I think this is an insult to Haddon's work. There is a place in the world for sentient object romance. You may be familiar with the prolific works of Chuck Tingle with erotic masterpieces such as "This pumpkin spice latte gets me off in a fun and sincere way because it's okay for people to enjoy popular things without being shamed for the perceived basicness of their beverage choices." Or books by Sabrina Cross, Holly Wilde, or Nicole Parker, where love interests span from caffeinated beverages to chairs, envelopes, deviled eggs, and much more. There is no real explanation for the sentience of these objects, and the absurdity of their sentient nature is part of the allure. These books are generally porn with plot or are otherwise pulpy in nature, and that isn't a bad thing or a wrong thing. They serve their place and purpose and even have their own interesting cultural implications, but they share little with a book about a woman who died wearing a mask that downloaded her consciousness. First and foremost, the important difference here is the former humanness of the sentient object. There's also a deep element of fetish content in sentient object romances, and it's clear that fetish isn't present in Volatile Memory. Even dating sims like Date Everything, where you literally can date every object in your house, are major contributors to this genre, which is ultimately, with respect, very silly. Volatile Memory is not silly, and it's not supposed to be. Risking sounding pretentious, on top of overt queerness given this is a lesbian romance, there is also an additional layer of queer, trans, etc. at play through the metaphor the mask serves as a vehicle for, and that is simply not aligned with the existing purpose of the sentient object romance genre. Anyway, let's look at cyberpunk. You might recognize cyberpunk from, well, games like Cyberpunk. Cruelty Squad, technically it's a subgenre of that subgenre called biopunk, and other similar pieces of absolute cinema like The Matrix, RoboCop, Akira. And in a universe where we are really splitting hairs, the gothic rock opera Repo the Genetic Opera could also fit in with the biopunk subgenre of cyberpunk. RIP, my guy, Anthony Head, you will always be famous. Anyway, cyberpunk is considered to boast low-life, high-tech settings, which we immediately see with the high-tech masks and space travel technology in the book, alongside the presence of scavengers and oppressive corporate overlords. They often incorporate elements of dystopian fiction, film noir, detective fiction, or mystery, and Lawrence Person, a writer, when describing characters in cyberpunk in an article published in 1998 in Nova Express, said, quote, "Classic cyberpunk characters were marginalized, alienated loners who lived on the edge of society in generally dystopic futures where daily life was impacted by rapid technological change, a ubiquitous data sphere of computerized information, and invasive modification of the human body." Willa is the quintessential cyberpunk protagonist. But Haddon effortlessly integrates the tropes of cyberpunk protagonists and makes it new by way of Willa being a trans woman. Obviously, he's not the first person to consider trans people in this genre, but it's not a novel idea. Body modification being more accessible in this society lends itself to her medical transition. Ubiquitous data spheres of computerized information complicates her transition socially and requires her to leverage her skill set as a hacker to be able to affirm her gender identity. She's marginalized for her transness, her status as a scavenger, her rejection by her family, and is generally a loner as a result in a setting where the speed of corporate and technological expansion constantly places new pressures on her as she fights to survive. Additionally, transhumanism is a common aspect of cyberpunk fiction. While some have criticized transhumanism as essentially reskinning eugenics, transhumanism is a philosophy that endorses the enhancement of humanity via technological advancements. Some people who have really drank their transhumanist Kool-Aid believe that we will eventually be able to transcend into a sort of post-humanness in this way. Obviously, the overlap between this approach to body modification and gender-affirming interventions for trans people is a fertile bed of grass for writers like Haddon to garden in. But an even more compelling angle is when we look at Sable. Sable has, from the start, by no will of her own, transcended death by her consciousness integrating with the lyrebird mask. Both of our protagonists, rather than their focus being on transcending their humanity, are more focused on reclaiming their humanity as the powers that be have constantly tried to steal their agency away. This is something Haddon does that makes Willa's transness not only feel well integrated into the plot, but integrated without the book being or the romance subplot feeling like it's solely intended to portray Willa's transness. It also makes her transness very accessible to readers that aren't trans women. On top of the opportunity to relate to and see oneself in Willa, Haddon presents the fantastical situation of Sable's disconnect to her body and selfhood as yet another vehicle for the reader to understand both parties. It's also the bedrock that their quickly intimate relationship is founded upon. Haddon has done this once before in another recent release, Reclaimed, in which the main character, a trans man, connects with his captor, long story, through empathizing with his disability and the injustices of the captor's homeland, which we'll talk about later. The same is true here, and it's really refreshing. Moreover, the sentient object aspect of Sable's story brings into question if love requires a body at all. And we can see the struggles in a way of lovers in a long-distance relationship, despite Sable and Willa barely being an arm's length apart since they met. So even though the book doesn't perhaps explore technology and science in a particularly interesting way, it does serve as a compelling vehicle for an ultimately very human set of themes and questions. And that's the type of stuff that Haddon really shines in. None of this would be possible, however, if Haddon didn't understand exactly what he was doing with the genre he wrote in, at least on the grander scale. This is why every single video we open our analysis with genre. Genre is the foundation for everything. You could say, But Ambrose, what about literary fiction? This only matters for genre fiction. And to that I say that very notion of literary fiction is a status indicator or a tendency, but not a genre in itself. And I hear some of the imaginary voices in my head saying, but Ambrose, the genre convention of literary fiction is that it doesn't have a distinct genre and doesn't adhere to tropes. And to that, I say all art is derivative, some art is just better at sleight of hand. Literary fiction as a term is often used as a way to put down the merit of certain fiction sweepingly. And while we can say your run of the mill trade paperback romance, for example, is exactly that, the hierarchy of literary canon, literary fiction, down to genre and pulp fiction has always historically favored cis heteropatriarchy and whiteness. Speculative genres, often ousted from literary fiction or forced to create their own literary canons, have been spaces where marginalized peoples have carved out their own rooms to relate to the world and with others. And for romance, this is especially true for cis women, though there is a growing sphere for men, particularly gay men, and trans people to carve their own niches. To lean on literary fiction as a genre is to behave under the impression that what makes something literary has ever been well defined. Frankly, the term literary fiction exists because there are pretentious, elitist nincompoops out there that will tell you that there is fiction that exists to entertain and fiction that exists to inform, educate, force you to ponder, and that these two things are mutually exclusive, when in reality the best works of fiction are the ones that do both. To be literary is a tendency or a quality, not a genre, much like how hard sci-fi and soft sci-fi are tendencies and not a genre. Additionally, how we interpret or analyze fiction is often different when we adopt a quote literary mindset. More often than not, your stock MFA candidate, and I say this with both pity and affection, will talk about how a book's statements relate to the author's background and therefore the world at the time it was written, and a critical analysis outside of literary studies may focus more on just the text itself and what it's trying to say. Both approaches are valid, and rather than say one is better than the other, I think that they should be integrated. All of which is to say everything is literary, and everything is entertainment. If people were only writing novels to argue something to the world and not to tell stories, no one would be writing novels. They'd just be writing essays. With a little intellectual elbow grease, you can discover that everything can have something to say. You can have fun reading something and still find something interesting to take home. You should be conscientious and curious when you read for all the things you read, but rather than expecting every book to be as dense and contemplative as something off the literary canon, you should concern yourself with what promises the book makes and whether it fulfills those promises. So, back to my point. When you understand the rules, you get the freedom to bend them, break them, and shake them around like a maraca. Haddon's understanding of his genre allowed him to take its framework and apply it to a compelling narrative around selfhood and gender that doesn't get as much spotlight in the genre as it could, and does it in a way that is accessible to readers of any community. However, his newness to the genre is also apparent. He writes sci-fi with the lack of groundedness we often expect in the genre, and instead writes more like science fantasy that doesn't identify itself as such, which could be confusing to some readers. Don't let the section header fool you. It isn't that the Volatile Memory duology fails as a romance, though what flavor of romance only becomes clear in Null Entity for reasons I can't say. That should be your first clue that the structure of this duology doesn't serve its own genre. While Haddon does separate the duology from his proper fantasy romance past works, a romance B-plot is core to the story. The relationship between Willa and Sable is the core driver for the entirety of Book 1, so it's putting in the work. But neither of them really fully acknowledge the nature of their relationship during that time, except what is essentially a small, chaste kiss, but it's on a mask. But you can have a horribly repressed, yearning romance that acknowledges nothing and everything at the same time. If you've read Gideon the Ninth, pool scene, iron spikes, I rest my case. The problem is because it's the sole driver of Willa's motivations for a time, other factors muddy the efficacy of the romance. It's a really common trope in fantastical romances for there to be like a psychic link of some sort between fated pairs. ACOTAR, Wolfsong, a reverse version in Twilight where Edward can read everyone but Bella's thoughts. Because of Sable's consciousness kind of melding and directly communicating with Willa's, where they literally have silent conversations and can show each other memories, but also nebulously block each other out when they learn later, Sable and Willa. Boys. I'm leaving that in. You're welcome. Anyway, Sable and Willa achieve the telepathy equivalent of U-hauling. Because the premise forces our two leading ladies to speedrun intimacy and the narration is retrospective, this gives the reader a strong impression that the book's got a case of the insta-love virus. It's an age-old flaw in genre romance, especially when it gets real tropey. Enemies to lovers, for example, once again pointing to Gideon the Ninth traumatizing creature it is, should require the two love interests to be at absolute odds against each other. Now we often see books marketed as enemies to lovers, where the rift between characters is as wimpy as a small disagreement or miscommunication that leads to dislike. Or it goes the opposite, where things that should get someone on a sex offender registry suddenly become fine after one small thing changes how the would-be victim sees their creepy future lover. Most romances, not all, but most, have some sort of incident in their narrative that tears the two lovebirds apart for a time, usually but not always in the third act. We kinda get one. It's where Sable kills Orchid and Willa is upset, and it rolls out in a way that could easily be read as a metaphor for sexual violence, but I personally read it as not being that because there is no reality in which sexual violence could be used to protect the other person, and Sable killed Orchid to defend them both. Yet, this rift between them literally gets resolved within a chapter. Again, part of this is the length of the book forcing that pacing choice, but it kills any potential tension. Romance requires certain tensions, will they won't they being chief among them, but also other factors, like extraneous situations pulling them apart, or differences in morality, desires, etc. These things do happen. The problem is, as just stated a second ago, how quickly those things get resolved. I firmly believe that this is because one core story got split into two books, so in order to honor Chekhov's gun, most of what gets introduced in each half gets utilized in their respective halves. I'm gonna be real with you, I don't think I've read a duology that I haven't thought would have been better as a trilogy or a standalone. My most recent frustration was with N.K. Jemison's Great Cities duology, I Love Her, Don't Kill Me. It isn't the notion of the duology that is inherently flawed, rather, I've rarely been satisfied with its execution, and this is doubly true for a set of two novellas. It's true that humans love symmetry, and a duology and a trilogy both can offer it. It's also true that the rule of threes really vibes with people, though there are also tried and true formulas of 5-act plays and so on. Personally, I've really enjoyed tetralogies. One of my favorites is the Giver Quartet, which most people I feel like have only ever read the first of the 4 books. I didn't feel this way about the Inheritance Cycle, but that's a rant for another time. What I didn't like about the Great Cities duology was that it felt like Book 1 was just set up for Book 2, and not that they were two interconnected but separate stories. If we're talking Freytag's Pyramid, an outdated model to be clear, while some subplots come to fruition, the A-plot cuts off either right at or right before the climax, and scenes became drawn out in order to add more meat to the story. From a commercial standpoint, I get it. More books equals more money. Some people may argue that they'd rather a duology where the scenes all matter versus a trilogy with fluff. But my argument there is that we shouldn't be entertaining needless scenes ever, unless you're writing in a genre where fluff is part of the fun, which usually you see in romance or fanfiction, which usually so is romance. Because of the duology format, what becomes abundantly clear once you start Null Entity is that Volatile Memory was just the inciting incident for Null Entity. Obviously, there's going to be some sort of cause and effect, so don't get me wrong, this isn't inherently a bad thing. Volatile Memory's primary concern is directly personal. Sable's revenge for her own death at the hands of her arranged husband. While we learn that he's tied to the greater world powers that are the reason for her death, those powers aren't fully fleshed out until the second book. We spend more time concerned with other scavengers, and official government spooky guys are generally pretty toothless. Again, until book 2. So what it feels like then is that all of our first part was just exposition with enough conflict within it to feel like it could stand on its own as a first in a two-part series, but it just didn't work for me. When I looked around online to see if anyone else was as troubled by duologies as me, I was sadly disappointed to find that most people see them as a way to flesh out standalones without the risk of bad sequel syndrome, which in my opinion makes no sense since there's still a sequel. Maybe this is me nitpicking, but in my mind what makes a duology good is how it takes advantage of its format. Generally, trilogies get a bit more flexibility because of the history of 3-act plays and so on. So with duologies, I feel like the plot 1 and plot 2 need to feel separate enough to require 2 books rather than what we see here, which is that we just have the stakes of the plot increase. We knew from the moment that Sable lived in secret experimental visor forge tech that this was bigger than her husband. But her and Willa flying off following his death, in my opinion, just felt like unfinished loose ends because our other threats existed only in the abstract. We weren't left with unanswered questions regarding where the plot would take us next, so much as what was the point of mentioning these abstract groups that have no screen time whatsoever, like the Edenic Order and the Marshall Syndicate. Orchid got more screen time than those two and Visor Forge, and he pretty much just existed to get not killed once and then actually killed the second time. How we structure stories is like a flower arrangement or a poem. Readers resonate more with stories that take ownership of their structure and feel, for lack of a better word, on purpose. There is a plot point that I can't discuss that I think gives some form of symmetry to the 2 books, but they aren't core to the meat of the narratives throughout for me to say that it's at all obvious for the reader. Anyway, 2 full novels is one thing. 2 novellas, that's a whole other beast. The pacing is entirely thrown to the wolves because we go from fast-paced to picking bugs out of your teeth getting off the roller coaster. Things are plainly stated to a fault because there's no time to do otherwise. Events happen with little room for rest in between, characters don't feel as well-rounded as they should, and imagery is about as abstract as can be gotten away with. For what it's worth, I think Haddon did a good job with such limited constraints, but I think that the constraints were arbitrary and not needed. I'm curious what led this book to become 2 novellas and what it would have looked like if these were just one book. I think it would have become much more intentional. Remember when I mentioned Haddon getting backlash for his trans man lead in Reclaimed? Haddon is a cis queer man, and obviously not being a trans man generates inherent blind spots just like any other identity. However, people had issues with his main character's appearance, his personality, really anything that didn't measure up to some readers' desires for a trans man lead. There's something to be said for the media's depictions of trans men, or lack thereof. Trans men are often depicted as white, often skinny, and where gay trans men are concerned, especially in romances, they're written as subby bottoms to a more masculine, dominant cis man. And sometimes there's some weird, almost heteronormative stuff where the trans man gets degendered almost. Sometimes there's a weird focus on the potential of impregnation too. The funny part is, what I'm describing, I've exclusively read from trans men. I'm not going to cite a bunch here because my goal isn't to knock on a vulnerable community for how they feel out their feelings, but I also feel weird about it. Anyway, obviously this doesn't mean it's only trans men that do this. But there's a lot of moving parts, and I'm not going to get into all of them here. Point is, while Haddon's depiction of his lead wasn't particularly groundbreaking in some ways, that book synthesized its fantasy setting, its mythos, and the character's transition really well in a way that showed a lot of empathy towards trans people's struggles without it being a book about transness, which I frankly haven't seen much of. While his cis love interest was more traditionally masculine, that's because his trans lead was more masculine in the, mean word for gay way, with love and respect as someone who claims the mean word for gay with pride and affection. There was no weird fetishy anything, and the cis love interest had history with both cis and trans people. Haddon also made a compelling connection between the cis love interest's disability changing his relationship to his body and the trans lead's relationship to his own. It's very apparent that our author is thinking things through, regardless of what some folks on the internet were saying. Haddon defended himself on social media with what I felt was the correct argument, that his main character for that book was just one representation, and that no trans character is going to resonate with every person that shares a label with them, to paraphrase. and that characters and people alike will prefer different language, different behavior, and so on in relation to their own bodies. Authors writing outside of their own experience will always be taking a risk, no matter how careful they are. I think that Haddon is very mindful of this, and the internet doesn't leave a whole lot of room for nuance when it comes to perceived injustices, like one representation not being exactly what they personally want when a book doesn't promise to. We talked in our last video on You Weren't Meant to Be Human about the harm of prescriptivist language and representation, and how marginalized authors can sometimes do themselves a disservice when they make their singular experience behave as authoritative. Haddon's books that feature trans characters talk about transness, but always feature a cis person connecting their relationship to the trans character's gender to something else about them, like their own body's changes, their autonomy, and so on, and doesn't claim any definitive statements about being trans. So bear in mind that same argument when we talk about our trans lead, Willa. I did some dumpster diving on Goodreads, our mecca of literary criticism, and found some people having the audacity to describe Sable as a chaser, and accuse Haddon of being a secret former transphobe who wrote this book out of prior guilt. I'm deadass, I think I lost some brain cells. Willa's transness is ultimately not a huge plot point, but it's vital to our understanding of the story. It's one of the key ways that Willa and Sable connect with each other and integrates itself well into the overarching themes of the story. What's important to remember, though, is that Willa is not transitioning through this story. Through various, vaguely referenced interventions, Willa has used the technological advancements of her time to change her body to better reflect her internal reality. She's fought hard for her body and her life, but she feels dissatisfied still and has expressed discomfort to the point of not really exploring her sexuality because of it. On some level, I would have liked to know more about what changes there were just to better understand where Willa is coming from inhabiting her body. However, because Haddon is a cis man, I think he played safe for fear of it being perceived as exploitative. For that reason, though, we don't exactly know what she's insecure about or what these gender-affirming interventions are, and that meant I didn't know what to expect from Willa's appearance aside from her having an undercut. We don't need to know about genitals or anything, but I think it would have been beneficial to have more detail in general. This also plays into complaints of telling over showing because it would have been more evocative for Willa to point out exactly what she felt dissatisfaction from, what changes she did as a result, and then leaving it at that without going too far into capitalizing on the capital TSTP, the suffering of trans people. Dysphoria for trans people is often very personal. We could have learned more of her character from what specifically she might focus on, is all. What I really find compelling about Willa's transness in this book, however, is the way that Sable is able to connect with her about this through her experiences with being disconnected from her body both in death and as essentially a child bride. Their society is bioessentialist and reduces people down to their ability to reproduce, with anyone with a functioning uterus and ovaries being treated as baby factories to produce able-bodied workers. Both Willa and Sable are women by gender, assigned different sexes at birth, and both are degendered from the same structure, Willa by being trans, and Sable by being infertile in life and in death inhabiting the lyrebird. There isn't a point in time in which Sable attributes womanhood to her experience having a uterus, though, like TERFs often do, to disconnect Willa from her gender identity. Instead, it's about the roles that bioessentialist rhetoric and patriarchy have created and their harm. And to boot, Sable doesn't express any incongruence by inhabiting Willa's body at times. If anything, she's elated by it, though part of it is the inherent intimacy of literally wearing your lover's skin, and also the joy of being human again for a brief moment in time. This is probably where that one person who made the chaser allegation got their ideas from, but my question there is, if you're going to throw accusations of cis people being chasers for being attracted to trans people, are you not perpetuating the idea that trans people are unattractive to their cis counterparts, or can only be if it's a fetish? Seems a little suspicious. Newsflash, it's not a sin to find trans people attractive. The things people find desirable are political, but they're political both in a language of harm and acceptance, for the same reason that some people use racism to excuse hatred of biracial or mixed-race children and judge interracial couples, but then the same racism fetishizing other races and prioritizing having interracial children. With that same concept in mind, finding a trans person attractive is not a bad thing, and it doesn't make cis people chasers. Finding transness in itself a point of attraction and sexual gratification, bypassing seeing trans people as full people, however, is what makes someone a chaser. Just as finding someone unattractive solely because they are trans can also reek of transphobia. Obviously, there are additional factors, like there are trans people who exclusively date other trans people because they feel safer that way, or people of color who avoid dating white people after or to prevent experiences of racism in relationships. But this is not that. Anyway, one thing I will say regarding Willa as a source of representation in this book, and obviously I'm going by learned experience since I'm not part of the group we're discussing, is that there's not a lot to her character, at least in Volatile Memory, aside from her transness and a few core survival motivators. Her sudden, intense desire to investigate Sable's death is her core goal throughout the novella. Some of my Goodreads dumpster dive finds have included accusations as a result of Willa being a caricature or stereotype of trans women based on this and the fact that Willa is a hacker. While I understand there's a stereotype of trans women going into computer science and IT, 1, we support women in STEM in this house, and 2, in a cyberpunk setting where there's a database keeping Willa from changing her gender marker alongside all the other things going on, this is a matter of the setting requiring this skill set rather than this being part of Willa's identity. But I can understand how Willa detractors would find this disappointing. I just think that this has more to do with her not being fully developed. And I have evidence to back this up that unfortunately is a hear me out argument until Null Entity is released in July. I believe this is an issue caused by the pace of the book rather than Willa's transness being poorly represented. In Null Entity, despite some precarious circumstances I can't disclose, she gains new desires and her relationship to her body also changes. We see some roundedness to her that we didn't see before. And likewise, we get to see Sable's understanding of her womanhood next to Willa's also develop. And I think that Haddon achieved something very interesting with this premise as a result. To fully dispel the chaser allegations, because sweet Christ that shit pissed me off, both books are very chaste. There's not a lot of time or opportunity for sex to really be part of the forefront of anything. Sable's allusion to past affairs with other girls in her past, her implied unwilling quote-unquote marital duties with her now-dead husband, and Willa's fraught history with sexuality out of discomfort or disconnection from her body is the most sex we see. The rest is yearning for things as simple as touching hands, given that Sable doesn't have any. This seems typical with the feral lesbian yearning as mythologized on the internet. Once again, lesbians of the world, I salute you and stand in solidarity. Let's move on. The book is about bodily autonomy. The book says bodily autonomy quite a bit, and considerations regarding the topic are described by Sable pretty frequently. Like a lot. It's rough. The same thing goes for the implications around gender and how Sable being a mask and Willa being trans are a point of connection. It's to the point that everything is said outright without much time for readers to interpret the text, and it's a similar issue to You Weren't Meant to Be Human, which we read a month ago, where we talked about new literalism and how it's really making reading a slog. This, again, I think is forced by the shortness of the novel. Novella? Anyway. However, when every single turn you're being told how to think about the book, it gets a little grating. So let's talk about theme. Generally, when we talk about what a book is, quote, about, there are two answers. One is the premise or plot, really depends on how short your answer is, and the other is theme. Premise is the spark notes of what happens, and theme is the underlying message or question. For example, 2 months ago we did an ARC reading of We Burned So Bright. The book's premise was an apocalyptic road trip between an old gay married couple, and now that the book is out, I can say that the road trip was to scatter the last ashes of their dead son who suffered through addiction and ultimately killed himself, with the question being if what all the two parents did to take care of him when he pushed them away was really enough. The themes include love, grief, parenthood, addiction, final goodbyes, among other things. Heartbreaking stuff. Part of what made the book weak was that there were so many points where the book deviated on this to pontificate about other stories. The premise here is pretty cut and dry. Scavenger discovers a sentient mask that contains the consciousness of a dead woman, and upon that discovery is convinced to go on a quest to get revenge on the dead woman's ex-husband, who is somehow tied to said death while their own relationship develops. Themes here include love, bodily autonomy, revenge, what it means to be human, and what it means to be a woman in a patriarchal society, abuse, capitalism, transhumanism, war, vigilante justice, morality, and much more. But even though bodily autonomy is called into question constantly, I don't think it's the chief theme here. Instead, I think it's what it means to be human and to be a woman under patriarchy. Here's what I mean. Having no bodily autonomy is the price of womanhood under patriarchy. Because trans men aren't afforded the same bodily autonomy as cis men, they also fall victim to patriarchy. So just when I say the price of womanhood, know that under cis hetero patriarchy, that includes trans men, unfortunately. So, Willa is forced by virtue of being a trans woman to be ostracized from society and lose a remarkable amount of agency over her life, sacrificing everything and living as a scavenger. Sable is literally sold as a child bride. These are two very different sides of the same coin. Sable dies and is trapped in a mask. She's constantly questioning if she's really human anymore and what it means for who she is. Willa and Sable are constantly trying to figure out where one ends and the other begins, and are put in conditions where this is necessary because of the powers at play in the book. In a society like theirs, love is not accessible. Marriages are reduced to procreation, and love between our two main characters is fraught because of the situation they find themselves in. Those situations came about because of capitalism, patriarchy, and war. Transhumanism, revenge, and vigilante justice come about as solutions to the problem. Everything stems from this question. So, is the book about bodily autonomy? Sure, to a degree. But the problem is the book is talking to me directly about bodily autonomy when there's a whole web of other things at play, telling me what it wants me to think instead of showing me the elements at play and letting me play toys. I think some of this is a level of Haddon lacking confidence as a new initiate into the science fiction genre, saying, hey, just so you know, this thing is going on about XYZ and is about this. Just so we're clear. And given that there's so little space for Haddon to take his time and develop things, of course we're going to go the path of least resistance to get what Haddon may feel is the most important theme out of the way so the action can keep moving. The problem is that would be Haddon interjecting what he feels is most important without letting the book speak for itself. We've discussed this before, but the creation of a novel is an act of artifice. But engaging with literature is an act of synthesis between author and reader, and critical readings of literature come about from the discoveries made in that synthesis. If you want readers to remember your work and not become a forgettable tally mark on someone's 200+ reading challenge on Goodreads, you need to let your ideas nestle into the minds of your readers. Trust us. This gets improved on by Null Entity, but it is still an issue. This one's divisive. Some of you may hate me for saying it, some of you may get war flashbacks from when Homestuck was popular. To my credit, I never read it, but my only friends in middle school were into it, so I pretended to know what people were talking about. Or, you may really love visual novels. You may think I'm the most correct person alive. We're talking about second person. For those unaware, second person is usually only encountered in situations where instructions are given, like instruction manuals. But some folks have used second person in fiction for self-inserts. A secret third thing, and it's not really officially second person, is when a first person narrator narrates as if speaking to the reader, who is another character in the story. Is this called something? No clue. We'll expand on this in a moment. Some people, I'm certain, especially if you look at consumer reviews on sites like Goodreads and to a lesser degree Storygraph, take one look at the second-person narration and say they hate it and won't pick the book up ever again. Now, mind you, this isn't actually second person. It's first person with a heavy dose of focal character treatment, as the story is actually Sable describing Willa's actions for a good chunk. However, there are points in time in which Sable has far more agency as a narrator and can then describe her own actions. This is one of the most sophisticated choices that Haddon makes as a writer, especially in the first chapter, where at the end it's revealed to us that we've actually been experiencing the story retrospectively from the mask's point of view. Say what you want about reading second person narration, even if that isn't actually what this is, that was a really great moment as a reader. That said, there are some limitations there. Our point of view being the mask creates some blind spots that contribute to the pacing issues. Sable experiences blank spots in time, or time literally moves different for Sable when she isn't in physical contact with someone, especially when she isn't in contact with Willa. This and the feeling of insta-love vibes for the situation give the illusion of codependency. I think codependency in general, though, gets thrown a lot irresponsibly, to be fair. Codependency requires a one-sided dependency from one party and a one-sided caretaker role from the other. While codependency is associated with caretaking, that isn't the core issue. My hot take here is that misunderstanding codependency actively disenfranchises individuals who do rely on others taking care of them, because it paints their need as morally incorrect and paints caretaking as a burden. The problem is actually boundaries, not, oh, we accidentally mind melded because of a mask boundaries, but centering your entire personality around whether you are the giver or receiver of care. I'm going to give an example from my work in progress. This is not a shameless self-plug, but it's the quickest example I can pull up. My main character was forced from a young age to be a caretaker to two young family members. He cared for his parents through their untimely deaths, and now has an occupation also that is centered around taking care of others. The problem is, because of traumatic situations that led him essentially to being a single father of two at 17 and an orphan in the same year, he hasn't had the time to think of himself outside of his obligations. So when he loses his occupation and his now adult adoptive children no longer need him, he has to figure out what he actually wants from his life, and his potential love interest does suffer from a debilitating chronic illness. So he has to parse out which parts of his identity are actually his ability to care for others versus what is him just taking care of everyone around him because it's the only way he feels safe and in control of his surroundings. But it's not either party's fault that he would feel compelled to display care towards someone he has romantic interest in, nor is it the interest's fault that he has his own share of illnesses. Is this in itself codependency? No. It could become it, and that's a fine line. Right now, you could say he has some obvious complex PTSD. Dude lived through a plague that wiped out most of his family, and he became a healer afterward. He's surrounded by death, and he has control over how quickly someone might die. So why wouldn't he have pride in his ability to help others? What would be codependency, though, is after losing his occupation and becoming essentially an empty nester, is reformulating his identity around being his chronically ill partner's caretaker at the expense of himself, who also has a disability. Except that isn't what happens, and he often gets scolded for flying a little too close to the forgetting to take care of himself son, and care given to his partner is also care returned and reciprocated. He retains the identity of a caretaker, however, to everyone around him, with the caveat that he listens to the people around him who tell him to chill the fuck out and let other people do the caretaking every now and again. By caring for others and that care being returned, aside from personality quirks, I'd describe that as interdependence, not codependence. So, are Willa and Sable codependent? The problem is the situation. Sable has no way to not be dependent on Willa. She's literally a mask. It's not her fault. Willa feels compelled to help Sable and ideally find her a body. Is this at Willa's expense? There are times of push and pull between who is driving the car, so to speak, but the problem with Willa is that aside from her life, which is already close to forfeit because she's broke and was originally going to sell the Lyrebird mask, she had nothing to lose to begin with. They have an immediately intimate bond because they have an immediately intimate situation. With everyone and their mother hunting them down, it's not a codependent you and I against the world attitude, it's literally just them against the world. Willa selling Sable is tantamount to manslaughter, and Sable is unable to control in any meaningful way what happens to her. When people are deprived of agency alone and find it again together, the notion of codependency isn't so black and white. We live in a society that will quickly label two people enjoying each other's company and not wanting to spend much time apart as codependent, when often this is just infatuation. The honeymoon phase is normal and healthy in relationships, as long as it doesn't go too far. Codependency is a real psychological phenomenon that requires a power imbalance and becomes toxic and dangerous if left unchecked. Your one-sided situationship is not codependency. It's another thing, but it's not codependent. But if you're dating someone dealing with alcohol addiction and they rely on you to enable them, you're driving them everywhere, you're supplying the alcohol, you're helping cover up the consequences of their addiction, and they idolize you as their biggest supporter, and you idolize yourself as their caretaker and feel like they'd be nowhere good without you, that's codependency. Stop calling things that aren't codependency. Anyway, rant over. The point of view choice, I think, is fantastic. What I think is, again, a flaw of it being two books is that it isn't readily apparent that Sable is speaking looking on the past, not describing the present. And that's the distinction that prevents Sable from coming off as too creepy. And when you understand this about the narration, it actually gives an impression of warmth rather than possessiveness. This is something I caught onto before I even finished the book, but when I went Goodreads dumpster diving, it became clear that not many people realized this. In general, though, the point of view choice was, in my opinion, well conceived and a good example of integrating form with theme. As we said earlier in the video, all art is derivative. Some is just better at sleight of hand. Certain snobs in the world, particularly the snobs I don't like, look at tropes as inherently destructive to art. While I hate with a burning passion trope-based marketing and feel like there are authors who structure their stories around tropes rather than a core theme, which I do find destructive to art, tropes in and of themselves aren't hurting anyone, and you're not a big stinky dookie head because you have some favorites. Moreover, they're inescapable. All your favorite plot lines and structures have been done before and will continue to be. Today's obsession was yesterday's B-plot of The Craft was yesterday's Tristan and Isolde. Georges, I don't know, Pulte, in 1895 identified 36 dramatic situations that could possibly occur in a story. Oftentimes, no story is just one of these situations, but a mixture of a number of them. We won't list them all here, but you can find them online. Volatile memory follows crime pursued by vengeance, pursuit, revolt, and if we're grasping at straws, involuntary crimes of love. Because sentient object fiction is a subgenre that, as we discussed, doesn't really fall in line with volatile memory, the way we distinguish them is that volatile memory doesn't follow the same tropes. Anyway, terms like enemies to lovers are admittedly annoying when they get used as buzzwords because most publishers and most writers really don't know how to write enemies and forego any potential cool things they could do by making them immediately boink in the first act, killing any romantic or sexual tension. As much as we can knock on tropes, though, they exist for a reason, and most readers, even if they aren't aware of the notion of tropes, will find themselves disappointed when a book sets up that trope and doesn't respect it. It's a matter of promises to the audience versus what is actually done. As I believe I said earlier, part of what makes volatile memory very easy to pick up and dive into the world is its use of common sci-fi tropes like single-use planets, universal currency called credits, and so on, and cyberpunk hallmarks like corporate overlords. I don't necessarily see this as a detriment to the book. Haddon, nor the publisher for that matter, are promising a new and inventive world. It's obvious, at least to me, that Haddon's intent is solely to focus on the human aspect of the story, not the societal implications or the science of the science fiction. Anyway, back to the point. Concern with writing tropes is a distraction. If you write following the formula of tropes, you'll write yourself into a corner and readers will know exactly what you're trying to sell them, which will immediately break suspension of disbelief. On the other hand, people who really like certain types of stories will have an easier time identifying books they know they'll like when tropes are readily identifiable. On a secret third hand, if you write fighting to avoid tropes altogether, you're going to have a hard time telling any story at all. No matter what, the more you let the notion of tropes dictate how you tell your story, the less genuine your writing will feel. Personally, I think that Haddon's usage of tropes was to eliminate distraction by saying, hey, here's our setting, you know what to expect now, so let's redirect our focus to what really matters, which is the relationship between the two main characters. Does this make it good or bad sci-fi? Purists who believe hard sci-fi is the only sci-fi worthwhile will say it's bad. I'll just say it's different. Remember, the notion of good versus bad writing is a convenient misnomer, and I use it frequently myself just because I'm used to it. However, what we're really in pursuit of is effective writing, and I would say that the desired effect was achieved. Anything beyond that is exceptionally subjective. With that in mind, though, just because I don't mind the reliance on tropes, that means it comes at the expense of other factors. The world building is relatively weak, though it improves in Null Entity. We don't have much groundedness in the world, so having our primary world building be obvious tropes makes the world feel very flat and empty. For lack of a better word, it feels like Haddon's trying to sell me something that I'm not interested in buying. Again, this improves in Null Entity, but I'd like to see Haddon dip his toes in more in-depth world building in the future, as his home genre is equally reliant on it. If you're working in speculative genres, always world build and learn the skill. The balance afterward is to not overdo it on exposition, which is usually the cardinal sin of writers in the genre. It's like DMs for tabletop games who spend more time crafting their world than they do crafting the story. And then it's like, okay, cool, shiny, evil overlord. What are we doing now? Kane Parsons, the brain behind the Backrooms movie, as I'm sure you all know, is a great example of this lesson. He stated in an IndieWire interview, quote, I have a 70-page document. I don't like drowning people in lore and mythology. I think it's an irresponsible creative choice. It happens a ton online when an independent artist gets to the spotlight, so to speak, for a little bit, where they make a single indie game, like a beta testing for a game or something. And then there's all this traction, and then YouTube channels begin picking up art and covering it as though it's a finalized creative item with a deep hidden lore and stuff. And then it leans way too hard into the lore aspect, and you just get this weird bloat where it becomes very alien to people who aren't avid fans of this thing and are approaching it for the first time. They're suddenly coming into it, and it's made inherently for YouTube channel dissection. Obviously, he's talking about like YouTube series and things, but I think that there's something to be said about that for books as well that are so unapproachable because of how dense the world building is. So, the same that he says is true of epic fantasy and hard sci-fi, and so on. So, having a compendium of sorts for yourself as you write is a great idea, but it doesn't all have to come out at once. While I'm just running on vibes, I felt like Haddon had the right idea to go kind of hard and fast with the details of the world, but he didn't actually have all the information prepared ahead of time. Or in other words, that some of our world building was pantsed rather than planned. We all have our methods. Null Entity doesn't come off as pantsed in the same way, which is another point for the argument that this should have been just one book. And now we cut to Null Entity. Let's just dive in right away. Our publisher summary is as follows. In Null Entity, sequel to Seth Haddon's bloody and sapphic Volatile memory, Willa and Sable take their revenge to the very corporation keeping the galaxy turning. With her identity erased from the corporate federation, Willa is a ghost in the untraceable, unpredictable, and fueled by vengeance. She fights alongside Sable, the AI consciousness whose murder they avenged, the one she loves in ways no system could ever define. Together, they've built a reputation for tearing through Visor Forge's carefully constructed lies. But notoriety has a cost. When one of their attacks draws the attention of the Edenic Order, a clandestine eco-resistance whose insurgents bloom with old Earth flora, Willa and Sable are offered something more than a chance to dismantle Visor Forge from the roots up. As they fall deeper into the Order's radical vision, tensions rise. Willa, seduced by ideology, by purpose, by something or someone else. Sable, pushed to her morals' limits when what she's wanted since death is at her fingertips. To survive, they'll need to embrace what makes them two minds, one body, and a shared resolve to bring down a corporatized dystopia, no matter the cost. Some of those parts were really awkwardly worded, but anyway, so So, Sable and Willa have been up to some business during our ad break. They've been taunting Visor Forge, disrupting broadcasts to spread the good word about Visor Forge, the corporate federation and Marshall Syndicate being both dookie and in cahoots, and so on and so forth, while also encountering eerie signals from the Edenic Order. As the summary states, some events come to be that draw the Edenic Order into the mix that pushes all our conflicting world powers to go head-to-head. The world building Haddon achieved finally feels like it matters in a tangible way in this book, but like its predecessor, I think that the format of a novella does it an injustice, as improvements in character development, world building, imagery, and more feel like a return to the form it should have been to begin with, instead of upping the ante on an already strong piece. Moreover, there are still some quirks here and there of Haddon telling and not showing. Volatile Memory, after my second pass over it, is a really middling read when you look past the interesting premise. It's repetitive, too fast for its own good, and eschews world building for pace. While I can also acknowledge why those very same choices make this novella approachable and effective for certain types of readers. It often, though sometimes due to the very niche situation Haddon has written himself into, preaches what characters are thinking and believing without showing. And it's very obvious by the way that Haddon writes that his home is in fantasy, not sci-fi. But he doesn't take advantage of the existence of the science fantasy genre to give himself a home there, too. Null Entity started slow, but I really am relieved to find that so much of what was missing from Volatile Memory is here. Sable and Willa's flaws really come out into the light in a good way, and while it's not as much as I would have liked, we get to see both of our heroines express desires outside of an inexplicable need for each other. Of course, Sable narrates to us, aside from a few blips I'm assuming are because I'm reading an ARC copy, in the past tense, so we have to give some benefit of the doubt that the insta-love thing is because we are reading from the perspective of someone who had already come to terms with their love ahead of time. We see more grounded world building, more compelling imagery including some really gross stuff, and our baddies finally have some teeth to them. However, like Volatile Memory, this is softer than soft sci-fi, and terms are thrown around with not much imagery. Sable, for example, describes herself as throwing up a firewall when about to be hijacked, but I don't know what that means from her perspective, or what that feels like or looks like. Additionally, I found at times certain scenes where whose body and whose consciousness was not where they should be was really confusing because of how much white room syndrome we get in what are otherwise very complex arrangements. And we do still see the heavy-handed pontificating about the core thesis of the book, about bodily autonomy and transness and humanity, etc. And while it's certainly not as bad as previous titles we've read, it's enough for it to be worth mentioning. Like its predecessor, this is a symptom of length constraints and likely an indicator of Haddon's home genre, since I've noticed a lot of genre romance tends to be just as heavy-handed. The conventions in the romance genre don't necessarily demand that a deft hand be used with the topics that Haddon overwrites. So while I've read some reviews that have wildly accused him of a number of things like virtue signaling, secret transphobia, and so on, I think this is a matter of the book breaching containment both into a new genre for Haddon where a lot of people are stumbling across this book not expecting it to be a romance, or because he's getting a bigger audience now that he's been picked up by a big publisher like Tor. Some people, when I was dumpster diving online, really felt like the book was overly sappy. Some felt it was overly toxic. And at the end of the day, I think that the book should have also been labeled a romance. It's currently listed as a science fiction action adventure story, which isn't untrue, but science fiction has not found a hybrid home with romance in the way that romantasy does, so some readers may find themselves confused. I've enjoyed a genre romance from time to time in my day, and none of this was really beyond what I've seen in that sphere. The ending, without spoiling much and assuming it won't change by publication, was compelling and well woven into the core narrative, though I felt like in some ways it was sudden and possibly a result of being written into a corner. All in all, I think that Null Entity is a worthwhile follow-up to Volatile Memory and makes up for what was a weak later half. I think that I would have had a much fonder opinion of these titles if it had just been one book, as we discussed in the analysis. Had Volatile Memory been one title, it would have, in my opinion, been easier for an editor to see the greater picture when giving Haddon feedback on developmental edits, and it would have been easier for Haddon to independently see where the story could have been cleaned up. At this point, I feel like Volatile Memory was an overlong prologue to the meat of the plot, which was Null Entity, and had Haddon spent more time grounding us in the characters and the world outside of Sable and Willa's mind melding, there would have been enough flesh for both sides. As they stand, the duology feels unequal and disjointed. Also, if you can hear my orange cat going absolutely fucking insane, you're welcome. I'm not cutting that out. I'm not re-recording that. Enjoy. So we have 3 verdicts today. Standing alone, Volatile Memory gets 2.5 stars, or the Castle Outcast category, and Null Entity receives 3.5 stars, Castle Approved. Together, they round to 3 stars as yet another Castle Approved title for our collection, if we squint really hard and press the books together. Unlike past titles on our channel with lower ratings, I didn't close either book feeling like I had been cheated of either my time or my intelligence, even despite them being a little rough around the edges. We always spend a great chunk of our time in the analysis complaining, but I did enjoy my time reading these books. And I think that this is a worthwhile read if you enjoy fast-paced sci-fi romps that don't go too far into the technical details, if you can handle romantically entangled characters that aren't healthy all the time, and, cohabitate a body, and enjoy a sappy little romance moment with your murder plots. It's good for your blood pressure. As always, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, or even if you didn't, make sure to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and let me know if there are any books you want me to cover, or if you just want to let me know that you made it all the way to the end of the video and you're cooler than everyone else, tell me what your favorite bird is. I try to upload a new video at least once a month with a new book review, so make sure to subscribe and ring the bell to get notified for when the next one comes around. Otherwise, my cats are going to fuse their consciousnesses together, chase you down, and terrorize you with their combined bad breath and chronic tummy trouble. It's bad.